Hello and welcome. Let's take a look at our top story. South Africa could be bracing for a big diplomatic challenge. Its foreign policy moves are in the spotlight, and billions of dollars worth of trade and aid might be in jeopardy. This looming threat is from none other than the incoming U.S. President Donald Trump. As per reports in the U.S. media, key Republicans are already pressing the incoming Trump administration to kick South Africa out of lucrative trade arrangements. This if the South African government does not change its position on Russia, China, Iran and Israel. South Africa is likely to be under intense scrutiny by the Trump administration. Some of the high-ranking Republicans have already shared their concerns over how Pretoria is leaning away from Washington's positions in a number of ways. Republican Senator Jim Risch, who is a high-ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, has spoken to the U.S. media, telling them how South Africa's differing positions have an impact on the country's national security. There is also Senator Tim Scott, who has slammed South Africa for harboring sanctioned Russian ships and expanding relations with Iran. Both of these influential Republican leaders are expected to become more powerful when President-elect Trump takes office in January. And with their advice, Trump might take an action against South Africa. Most at risk is trade with the U.S. under the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or the AGOA. Now, this is a trade agreement between the United States and eligible sub-Saharan African countries. It provides duty-free access to the U.S. market for most exports from African nations. As per last year's data, South Africa has been the top beneficiary with around $3.6 billion worth of export, mostly vehicles and parts, fruits, precious metals and chemicals. However, U.S.-South Africa trade under the AGOA could be affected under the Trump rule. South Africa could also lose tens of thousands of jobs. Participating countries are required to meet a set of conditions to qualify to trade under the program. But key Republicans think that Pretoria does not meet these requirements, as it has boosted ties with the U.S. rivals and has become foes with its allies. Talking about the rivals, firstly, Russia. South Africa says it maintains a neutral stance on the Russia-Ukraine war, refusing to condemn Moscow's invasion at the United Nations. Then South Africa also joined Russia for military exercises. The U.S. has also accused Pretoria for allowing naval bases to be used by the Kremlin. Then comes China. China probably comes first on the list of rivals for Trump, but it is South Africa's biggest trading partner. The two countries are also the founder members of the BRICS Trade Organization, a group that Trump has threatened to impose 100% tariffs on. Next is Iran. There have been accusations of deep links between Tehran and Pretoria. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has welcomed the inclusion of Iran in BRICS and has vowed to improve ties with the country, long known as a sponsor of Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. Now, this brings us to Israel, a key U.S. ally, but accused of genocide by South Africa. South Africa dragged Israel to the International Court of Justice with this allegation. South Africa's majority ANC party has also met with Hamas. The government has also issued a statement condemning the killing of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh this year. Though South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa had already been walking a tightrope balancing ties with Washington and its rivals, it did not impact trade under the Biden administration. But now it seems inevitable under the incoming Trump administration. Can Ramaphosa avoid the Trump trouble, or will he be forced to reconsider his alliances? To discuss this further, we have with us Patrick Bond, a political economist who is joining us live from Johannesburg, South Africa. Thank you for being with us.
Good to be with you. Thanks, Alison.
Now, what leverage do key Republicans have in influencing the incoming Trump administration's stance on trade agreements with South Africa? And how might South Africa's relationships with Russia, China, and Iran, as well as Israel, factor into these decisions?
Well, it's about 60 billion rand a year, about $3.5 billion a year in the trade benefits through the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. And even though that was just renewed, at least through September, it is likely, I would say, that the hardcore Republicans will want to punish South Africa now that they have solid majorities in the Senate and House, the presidency, and the Supreme Court. So they're in complete power. That means they can override the World Trade Organization, as Trump has done before with sanctions against South African steel and aluminium.
Mm.
So I think cutting some of those benefits, which would hurt major Western firms, in fact, mostly Mercedes and a few German car companies, the Australian BHP Billiton for aluminium, the Indian but Luxembourg-based ArcelorMittal for steel. Those will be some of the companies hurt if those trade benefits are taken away. There's also some aid, especially the antiretroviral medicines that partly are bought from India through CIPLA, but also to some extent manufactured in the US. So there'd be another boomerang if the AIDS medicines under the so-called PEPFAR presidential executive program on AIDS is cut. But then there's the other factor, Alison, which is here in Johannesburg,
Right.
November 2025, like Delhi last year and like Rio de Janeiro last month, will host the G20. So obviously, Cyril Ramaphosa, with his themes of solidarity and equality and sustainability, he'd like Donald Trump to be there and to be a cooperative player. I mean, that's, I think, a little bit far-fetched, a little bit of a fantasy, but that's another area where the US will have a certain leverage. They're meant to take over the G20 in 2026. But, with Trump, he's just breaking so many bilateral relations. Even before he comes in, he demands Greenland be sold to him by Denmark. He demands the Panama Canal be given back or bought back. And he's putting big tariff threats not only in the BRICS, but on next door neighbors Canada. He wants that to be the 51st state, and Mexico. So it's a wild card guess as to whether Trump will follow through, because he's a great con man and he's also a bully, and we'll see which one prevails.
Sure. Right. Could South Africa's position on global powers like Russia and China strain its trade relations? You have touched on this with the US under the Trump presidency. And what potential economic implications might this have for both countries?
It's so interesting that if you're dealing with a bully, you can do one of two things. You can be obsequious. You can try and flatter them. And often that works with Donald Trump. He loves to be flattered. And that's what Cyril Ramaphosa, the South African president, did not long after Trump was elected. He said, no, come to Johannesburg. We'll find a place to play golf. You'll love the golf and the weather in November. And his ambassador to the United States, Ibrahim Rasool, said last week that it looks like the megaphone, that is the Gaza solidarity, the attempt to support Palestinians in The Hague, in the International Court of Justice, by basically calling out genocide in the International Criminal Court, by getting the arrest warrants against Prime Minister Netanyahu, that megaphone diplomacy will end. And that was very disappointing to many in South Africa who thought, well, this is a very strong country. There are coal exports from South Africa, the number one coal exporter to Israel. The BDS, boycott, divestment, sanction demand has gone unnoticed. The attempt to cut diplomatic ties or to end the mercenaries from South Africa who fight for the Israel Defense Forces. Those ties remain, and I think they probably will, because we know Donald Trump is as close as can be to Netanyahu.
And Patrick, finally, in your view, how might South Africa navigate its diplomatic stance on the contentious issues like Iran and Israel, while still maintaining favorable trade agreements with the US, given this political pressure from Republican leadership?
Well, I mean, Alison, if the BRICS continue to expand, and don't forget, here in Johannesburg, they added Iran, as well as the UAE and Egypt, Ethiopia, and they tried to add Saudi Arabia, which now looks like it is moving away. But then in Kazan in October, another 13 partner countries have committed to join, including some important Southeast Asian nations. So you could sort of see an alternative arrangement, a pole in which, if Ramaphosa feels he's not getting anywhere by playing nice, with this bully. He could then prepare South Africa for rejigging itself, not being so dependent on the exports of cars and aluminium and steel and grapes and wine to the United States. I think those will be cut, and those will be serious vulnerabilities. But also to make the point, probably, that a United States that for 4 years, 2017 to 2020, had Donald Trump and survived, and the United States electorate pulled out of it. And I think it's that hope, in a way, that there is a
Sure.
post-Trump, even before Trump comes to power again, that will give the world hope. The crucial one being the climate catastrophe, because Trump has committed to walking out of UN climate negotiations. South Africa plays a sort of middle road, often working closely with the West, but being critical as well of the climate catastrophe being caused by
Right.
high emitting nations. And India, of course, as well, having done so just at the end of the last UN climate summit
Right.
by being very angry that not enough funds were delivered by rich countries. I think that'll be one of the most important underlying tensions. It
Yeah.
will play out in Brazil, the BRICS in the middle of the year, the big climate summit at the end of the year. And then the question really will be, will South Africa have the guts to stand up to Donald Trump? Donald Trump may not even come here to the G20. He may call this the SOL nation and send
Right.
his deputy, J.D. Vance, or at some point he may just drop out of many of his multilateral arrangements and withdraw the offer for South Africa to join the United Nations Security Council as a permanent member, although without any veto power.
Sure.
And all we can do is guess. And I hope that the people in Pretoria are not only trying to play nice with Donald Trump, but they've also got in the back of their pack another harder card, which would be to set up some alternative arrangements and not be so dependent on the US for trade, investment, finance, and the AIDS medicines, and to find other ways to make up for, especially electricity that goes into those exports, distributed to small businesses here. Because next month we may also see our load shedding, our electricity cuts. Those would be the sorts of alternatives to trying to work with Donald Trump, a task that may be even beyond Cyril Ramaphosa.
Right. Patrick, thank you very much. It's always great to have you on the show. Thanks for your valued insights.